Welcome to the Global Missions Podcast, a show for Christ followers who want to participate more effectively in God's work both at home and to the ends of the earth. Visit us at globalmissionspodcast.com to find show notes, resources, and previous episodes. You can also engage with us through Twitter and Facebook. We would love to hear from you. And now, here's your host, Rob Magwood, better known to many friends as Mags.
Hi, everyone. I am really excited about today's episode. It is the first in a small number of episodes where we're going to seek to highlight how God is at work in a particular area of the world. This idea has emerged from feedback that our listeners have given us regarding the podcast, and our prayer is that these highlight episodes will be helpful to local church leaders in a couple of things. One is growing awareness of how God is at work in a particular region, and then also learning how their church can possibly participate in that region. Today, we are going to be highlighting how God is at work in Central Asia. Our guest today is Bruce Huseby, who serves as the pastor of global ministries at Calvary Church in Grand Rapids, Michigan. In addition to his role at the church, Bruce also serves on a number of leadership teams and advisory groups for different ministries. Bruce, it was a long list. We can't possibly list them all. It would take the whole podcast.
I'm not sure of that, but great to be with you, Mags.
Yeah, we appreciate so much your joining us today. And of course, Bruce has a particular interest in the part of the world that we're going to talk about in just a few minutes. He and his wife, Debbie, live in Michigan, as I mentioned. They have 4 children and 7 grandchildren. And he mentioned just before we started recording that in the next couple of weeks, you are going to be great-grandparents.
We are. I'm way too young for that. Just remember
Way
that.
too young,
Way
but
too
what a great joy.
It is a great joy. Thanks.
Praise the Lord. That's good news. Well, Bruce, just as we begin, I want to say welcome to the program and ask, how did you become interested in Central Asia?
Well, it began when we came to this body here in Michigan and we started to pray through the unreached peoples of the world. And God just had highlighted a particular people group, the Uzbek people group, that we realized at the time we were praying through it and through Joshua Project, that probably there was only less than 500 known Uzbek believers in the world. And we started praying for that group, and we were challenged by a Uzbek national who was living in California, and it began a process where we, as a local church, first became engaged. So that's the first step that took place. And then we started becoming involved with various groups that we became aware of, prayer initiatives. And so that was the initial involvement.
Well, I appreciate right off the hop, you've mentioned a resource that we recommend to our listeners, joshuaproject.net. It's a resource online that allows a church or an individual or a missions committee to research people groups and to understand their access to the gospel. And so, Bruce, just speak to that a little bit. How did you use that tool at your church?
Well, we started out with a prayer initiative and just started praying and saying, God, how would you use us in this region of the world, specifically with the Uzbeks? But God quickly expanded it into all of the areas surrounding the former stands of the Soviet Union. We'll give a quiz to everybody after this, but Kyrgyzstan, Kazakhstan, Tajikistan, Turkmenistan, all surround this, are part of the former Soviet Union, and other regions that are part of what's considered Central Asia as well, like Azerbaijan. The uniqueness of each of them is they're Muslim people groups that also exist within the borders of Russia as well, and even Northwest China. So that became the primary focus for us, and it was prayer and God just expanding it. And then we found out of some things that we could become involved with as a local church that might help see the gospel go forward through, whether it was radio broadcasts going into the region, whether it was in those early days, there was so much limitations because the countries were so closed to the gospel. We got involved, though, with Bible translations, and were able to be part of seeing those funded and produced and get out to the people. And then it started, as the Lord started opening up doors, where we were able to start mobilizing. And we took short-term teams in to do things in universities, as well as helping with medical issues, business issues, computer skills. That ended up to more career mobilization, where we have some families who minister in various parts of that part of the world. And so it just kind of became a stepping stone process with small steps and larger steps along the way. And we've learned a lot through the years, that's for sure.
Wow. What a wonderful story. And I think it would be of some encouragement, too, to Joshua Project staff to hear that that all this began rather with using their resource and beginning with prayer. Yeah, there is an episode, I forget which number it is, but there is an episode where we actually talk with the team behind JoshuaProject.net.
Okay. I'll give another plug. That all happened because of projects we did with the Perspectives course and getting our people through Perspectives and seeing how are we going to deal with the unreached peoples of the world. We can't just talk about them. We've got to do something.
Mm-hmm.
And so several of us did projects of different unreached peoples. And this is another great resource for every church that can get their hands on it. So
absolutely. And we'll put this in the show notes too. We have an interview with Perspectives to explain what it is and how it can serve in your church. It's a program of study over approximately 13 weeks with weekly studies, and it can be quite intensive. We also have another episode on the Kairos program, which is a little bit shorter, and these resources can be a great encouragement to church. So now, Bruce, you've mentioned already some of the types of work you've been involved in Central Asia. You know, it sounded quite diverse there. So this has been over a season, right? This has been an extended period of time that you've been engaged in this part of the world.
Right. As a church, we've been engaged for over 25 years. And I don't think there's any area we have not been involved with or touched. So whether it has to do with community development, whether it has to do with leadership development, pastoral training, evangelism, discipleship, church planting, media, children's and youth work, all kinds of exciting things, some that didn't even exist, and now a new Central Asian medical community. There's a whole Central Asian missions movement taking place now from within the region. So it's just been an amazing journey, actually. And I can describe maybe later in the podcast about how we got involved with that whole area.
Yes. Yeah. Well, let's lay some foundations then and begin with kind of an overview of the region. Tell us a little bit about Central Asia, please.
Well, as I mentioned, it consists primarily of the former stands of the Soviet Union. And the whole region was divided up by Stalin into some very strange borders. And he did so to actually divide the people groups so they would not even be in the same country as where their majority peoples were. And he did a masterful job that caused a lot of ethnic tensions that exist still today. And it's a region of the world that largely has been considered a black hole in a lot of the missions world because they don't know about it. They don't know what's happening there. But it's a rich history. It's really where the ancient Silk Road passed through from China to Persia. And so you travel through some of these cities like in Bukhara or into Samarkand. And there's cities who are thousands and thousands of years old that were used in the ancient trade routes. So historically, it's got a rich history. Matter of fact, there's a lot of history in northwest China among a group called the Uyghur people, who were a Christian group 1,800 years ago before they were Islamicized. And it's just been a new challenge to see the gospel come to them. Daniel is reportedly buried in Uzbekistan in the city of Samarkand. Bartholomew is viewed upon as one of the very sacred, important people within the country of Azerbaijan, which isn't one of the stands, but was part of the former Soviet Union and very important part of the region as well there on the Caspian Sea.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
So if you think basically Central Asia, you think general the borders would be to the east are China, to the south would be Afghanistan, and to the southwest, Iran. You'd go off to the far west to Turkey, and then up to the north is Russia, even though, as I mentioned, part of what we consider the Muslim people groups of Central Asia are involved in Russia, the Bashkorts, the Tatars, the folks in the North Caucasus region, and so forth. So actually over 200 people groups.
Wow. 200 people groups. And I wonder if you can speak, it would be a generalization, but I'll use Joshua Project language, the progress scale in that region. Are many of them reached? Are many of them unreached? And are there unengaged groups there?
Yeah, we still have in one region, there is 45 unengaged people groups just in one region alone. There's no Bibles in their language. They're just being produced in some sections within that region. The exciting thing about that particular region was we have some organizations working together who are training nationals from other parts of the region and going in to evangelize and make disciples. And we're seeing great headway when it comes to that. I think as far as a scale, it's so hard sometimes to get accurate counts. But what we've seen, for instance, in the country of Kazakhstan is a huge response to the gospel. Basically from the mid-90s to the mid-2000s, about 2006, we saw an incredible amount of influx of believers, kind of that fresh wind that blew through the region, and winds in the House of Islam. another great resource. But I think that what took place is most of these government leaders were part of Soviet day leadership, and they really never changed their stripe. So what we knew traditionally as the KGB still was very active in the region and keeps things pretty much under their grip the best way possible that they can. And so what we've had to do is, again, through the power of prayer, we've seen some great things take place, and God is at work in some incredible ways. Last year was the first time that the Uzbek Bible for the Uzbek people was produced, and it was printed and distributed, and the government officially sanctioned it in Uzbekistan along with a book that explained it and put the official government stamp upon it. So if anybody would destroy it, they would be in trouble with the government. So God is at work and gives us little handfuls on purpose to keep us encouraged. And there's other days that you go, okay, Lord, you got to take over, because the flesh and the human leaders tend not to be too friendly to some of the things of the gospel.
Mm-hmm. Well, you've shared some of the ways that you've seen God at work, a great story about the scriptures being sanctioned there. Are there other things that come to mind that you would encourage us where you see kingdom work advancing?
I would say there's three areas that I think of when you ask that question, Mags. One is the whole area of media, where we're in a media society in the West and even in Europe. And you think about parts of the unreached world. I think of North Africa and the Middle East. Media has been there for years. There's a lot of organizations working, satellite television. This is all new stuff for us in Central Asia. And we're seeing some great results of nationals being helped along by expat groups to produce everything from children's programs to really high quality things for adults. And God is just at work in amazing ways. We're seeing incredible responses because of media. I think the second area is getting rid of more and more of what we would term the NGO approach that was used for years, and especially seeing business leaders going in and establishing quality businesses. They're there to see that take place and to make disciples through what they're doing in business. And we're seeing this amazing stories. I could tell you, if I get specific about them, I might jeopardize some of those businesses, but we are seeing some really positive things taking place through the integrity of being there to build a business and the integrity to make disciples, which is helping not only fund the local church, but also see just a real excitement of coming up and holding up the arms of those leaders within the local movements. And I mentioned 2006, so forgive me for going back there. 2006 is where there was kind of a purging of basically foreign workers from the region. Those purgings have happened on several occasions in various countries within the region. But as you saw in China years ago, God was at work and God raised up his national church. And I could just speak from country to country of what God is doing in amazing ways. Many of the churches still meet underground, but many of them are starting to surface now in ways because of newfound freedom. So it kind of goes across the board. But the gospel's going forward, brother. So.
That's wonderful news. I have a question, a follow-up question, Bruce, to the degree you can answer. And I just mention again for our listeners, we want to use great care when we talk about this part of the world in order not to jeopardize the work that's going on there. You mentioned some businesses being established there. One of the tensions that we wrestle with on this podcast is the value both of short-term mission and long-term mission. I wonder, though, when you think of those businesses, if you could comment how long it takes to establish a business. I'm sure there's not a hard and fast rule, but can it be done short term, or is it medium term? Is it long term to earn that credibility and have a viable presence?
Well, we have learned in the situations we are in is that we have a expat on the ground. And in each case, they are working in collaborative efforts with national leaders on the ground. And then we are able short-term initially to provide the expertise from writing business plans, helping with trafficking issues with jewelry makers, to help be creative, to help because there's a lot of trafficking that takes place within Central Asia to other nations. So there's a number of layers that we've been involved with. Education, as I mentioned, doctors we've sent over. We have a whole group that helps the Central Asian medical movement now with some expertise. So it's just, short term has been a real catalyst for us to mobilize some of our professionals. So we've tried to break down that secular sacred barrier when it comes to that in many ways. We want to mobilize the 99% in our congregation who probably are never going to go into career work, but also use those who are going to go. They feel that they're going to go into the culture, learn the language, and be part of it. So we're a both-and group.
I really appreciate that. We often say that on this podcast. It's not an either or, it's a both and. It's not short or long term, But to have both working in a deliberate cooperation is a beautiful thing and leverages the talents and capacities of the Lord's people. Well, in just a moment, we're going to talk further with Bruce about how we can pray for Central Asia and some of the specific ways that a local church can participate with sharing the gospel in that part of the world. Just before we get to that, we'd like to share this missions resource that we hope will be helpful to you and your church.
Your profession, your skills, your passions. It's you making disciples of the nations. Crossworld desires to help you engage the world's least reached marketplaces in the ways God has gifted you. To learn more about Crossworld and our global opportunities, we invite you to visit crossworld.org today. And now, back to today's conversation.
Okay, we're back with Bruce, who has been helping us understand a bit more about Central Asia, and we want to begin with ways that we can pray for that part of the world. Bruce, how do you encourage us as Christ followers in the West to be praying for this part of the world?
Well, again, the best way to pray is to get educated. So to understand who the peoples are, how can you then engage? And again, you've mentioned Joshua Project, but there's other groups that have done some great work to pray for these individuals. Prayercast is another great tool. They have done a lot with the unreached peoples and how to pray for them, and actually having locals who pray prayers for their people. So one of the best ways is just to get educated so you can pray intelligently about the region. And when you look at a map of countries that you go to an airport, you say you're flying to, and you realize they don't have any idea where you're going. Most of the people in your church don't have any idea where it is. So if you can start getting a globe and having children lay their hands on that part of the world and praying for the boys and girls who need to hear the gospel of Jesus can be a great tool. Just getting people to understand that there's a lot of people out there, and that this is one region where they haven't heard about Jesus yet. I would also say pray for the people because there's persecution. The persecution is often severe, not to the point what we hear in some parts of the world where death may be the consequence, but many people are fined a year's wages for possessing maybe more than one Bible or possessing a Bible at all or any religious material. Many are imprisoned and beaten in prisons. I often hear nationals say, "Oh, I get to go to prison again. Just another opportunity for me to share Jesus with the guards." And their attitudes are amazing, but a way we can pray is in the midst of their persecution. Churches shut down, burned, people harassed constantly. Definitely an area of the world where this is taking place. So that's another area you can pray for the people of this region, and pray that the Holy Spirit would just burst open the floodgates, that the national church would be bold and strong, and that we would know how to best encourage them. So I know that's a lot based in prayer, but the question is, how can we pray? I would just say those are a few areas of how you can pray.
Very helpful and a great model for any part of the world, really, and especially for this region of Central Asia. We wanted to spend the second half of the episode talking about practical things. There's the first one. We can pray for the Lord's work and for our sisters and brothers in that part of the world. Bruce, what's a second way that the church from the West or North America can participate in sharing the gospel here?
Yeah, there are several ways. And of course, it means some level of engagement. You mentioned short-term earlier. There are short-term opportunities in the region. You just have to be wise in dealing, especially with either the locals who can help navigate that or with expat workers in the region that could help. One of the biggest areas that we're seeing that I'm hearing over and over from my national brothers and sisters, I've heard 1 Corinthians 4:15 quoted me more times in this region of the world, saying we have many teachers in Christ, but not many fathers. And we need to understand that most of the believers, there's only one generation existing of believers within this region of the world, and they don't know how to do a lot of stuff. They need mentors. They need people who, even on a short-term basis, would be willing to come and love on them, to encourage them, to ask them good questions of how you do ministry. And that, frankly, is one of the areas, even for long-term mobilization, that I've encouraged people going is don't try to be the fix-it person from the West and ride on your white stallion. What would it mean to come in and hold up their arms, fly under the radar, and where it doesn't look necessarily pretty in your prayer letters sent home because you're spending your time sipping tea and encouraging national brothers to stand firm and mentoring them and discipling them and teaching them in very much what would be a small group setting. But this is what the nationals really desire. One of the ways we seek to especially meet some of those needs. So that's another way that they could become involved. Still another would involve the whole area of pursuing a little deeper level of partnership.
Mm-hmm.
And I know that may bridge into another area, but there's a lot of great organizations. Matter of fact, we work with over 150 organizations, largely from North America, but there's others from Europe, from South Africa, from Singapore, from Korea that are all working. We have Chinese groups coming in as well to the region. So it's one of the areas is to find maybe a local organization or agency that understands the region and how you could engage with them and some of the things they're seeking to do. And we have all kinds of availability to give resources, some of those things that I know exist that could be helpful to a local church looking at how we could do anything from a small project to more of a large scale project, if that's what they would desire.
Wow. Well, lots of ideas there. It sounds like there's a very broad potential. It just is a matter of prayerfully discerning how and with whom to cooperate, really, and to partner together.
And one of the advantages, if people are interested, Mags, they could write me. I think you're going to have my email on your site. There's actually several North American expressions of Central Asian people groups that meet throughout the year. There's one for Azerbaijan. There's one for the Turkmen, for the Tatars, the Uyghurs. There's one for the people of the North Caucasus and so on, that I could put them in touch. And one of the best ways to figure out how to partner as a church is maybe go to one of those meetings and just listening and learning and seeing how you as a local church could engage. I know one region specifically, they're just looking for churches, big or small, who would just start praying for a people group. One of these 45 unengaged people groups, that people would start praying that God would bring someone in to engage in their lives, these people who so desperately need to hear Jesus.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, thank you for that. We will include Pastor Bruce's email contact at the end. Why don't you mention it here, though, Bruce, and we can put it in at the end as well.
It's simply Bruce, BRUCE, at calvarygr.org.
Calvary GR, Grand Rapids, right?
Right, calvarygr.org.
Okay.
Yep.
And we will have that in the show notes if you can't jot it down right now, if you're driving or riding a bike or something. I wonder if I can turn this, Bruce, and ask, do you have any cautions for churches and for Christ followers as they begin this consideration? They might desire to be involved. How would you caution them?
Yeah, I think anytime you're dealing with any part of the unreached world, there's a level of caution. You obviously can't print everything in your church newsletter. You can't necessarily get on stage if you're live on the internet or taping those and start talking about all the details. So one of the cautions I often give people is do your homework well and realize what you're getting into. But there's still ways of getting people really engaged with your local body. And that can be everything from actually finding individuals, because now they're all over North America, who have immigrated, and finding out some of their needs and finding out what you can do even as a body to maybe help them out or engage with them. But I would just say the primary caution is count the cost. Count the cost, because you're not going to be able to talk about your worker who's down maybe in doing great work in Honduras. It's just not the same dynamic. You can't start saying, oh, here's what they're doing and here's what they're applying in Azerbaijan, because that can jeopardize people very quickly. And anybody who's worked in the unreached world understands some of that. At the same time, the caution is obviously the national brothers and sisters of this region. I mentioned earlier, a lot of the same leaders were those that were the leaders in the Soviet times. Well, that's one of their fears, is not their greatest fear. The greatest fear is radical Islam. And since these are all Islamic countries, the majority Islam, and there's a portion of those populations who have been radicalized. Not that by a long shot, most of them are very, oh man, I've been in way too many homes in Central Asia where you walk by and they just welcome you in. They're just so loving and hospitable, and great opportunity to get to know them. But there are those fringe groups who actively pursue persecution of the believers. So you need to be cautious in that area. And there's other things that I could probably get more specific with if a church or a group of individuals is interested in that.
Well, let's just say what an offer this is. If your church is interested, or you feel some desire to continue learning on behalf of your church, maybe guiding into this conversation, Pastor Bruce would be a great contact with wise and experienced counsel to offer along the way. Maybe let's turn toward the missions committee, Bruce, and say if there's someone listening who really would love to see their church participate in this part of the world, how would you suggest they get started? What's the first step?
Actually, I would encourage them to contact me. That sounds like I'm inviting a lot of phone calls, or maybe not any. I would say that I could probably give a personal word of what they're looking for and understand what they want. If they want to start with basic engagement, I can give them specific issues that we're dealing with in the region that they could start praying for and start writing people and engage with that specific area. That, for instance, if I could take time, just like one area that's just exploding in the region right now. 12 years ago, there was no known ministry in the entire region to 12 to 18-year-olds because of just the way the government cracked down in most of those regions. Today, there's over 4,000 trained youth leaders reaching over tens of thousands of young people in that region. It's just been an amazing thing of God's working in that region, but there's always the need to come alongside against some of these leaders and to pray and what does it mean, and university ministry and all kinds of things that become opportunities for churches to look at how they can engage. The whole idea of what does it look like to come alongside of a businessman or some other areas can be ways that, again, I deal within this region and I deal with both large and small churches. And there's always a role for anybody who sees this as a place where God wants them to become part of the lives and the dynamic of what's happening there.
Wonderful.
I would say, if I may, there is one meeting a year, and it takes a little more resources to get to it, but it's a meeting that happens every year when we gather together over 200 national leaders. Many of the organizations that I mentioned, about 180 organizations, gather together for a major collaborative effort to see how we can work better together than we can by ourselves. And that's where the local church can really see how they can fully engage in a specific area. They can go to various interest groups or workshops and see, oh, wow, here's what's happening in media and youth ministry. Here's what's happening in business for transformation. And you just name it, it's offered. And actually this year, our meeting is going to be our 30th anniversary. The founder of the meeting is going to be back with us, as well as some of the early pioneers that helped this be established. So that becomes, in many ways, the lifeblood of how people understand, hearing from both the national side and those living in the region, as well as outside partners and groups that have come together to best collaborate together. And this is not one of the reasons I'd like to use this word collaboration rather than partnerships, is so often partnership gets the connotation, we like your part on our ship. But I like to look at the fact that we truly are working together. We can't exist without each other. And the body of Christ, each supporting ligament, as Ephesians says, we need that. And every church, large or small, that is burdened for missions, I would pray, they might have things all over the world. And whether it's Central Asia or another unreached part of the world, please get engaged in some way. Don't ignore that huge block of people. The statistics may change all the time, but the latest I think I heard is 2.8 billion people who have never heard the name Jesus. So we'd love them to be engaged in Central Asia if that's where God would lead them. But wherever God leads them, I pray that any listener that you have would challenge their church to be involved with unreached people somewhere.
Well, I was going to ask you if you could stand in front of the missions committees collectively, what would you say? And I think that was what you just said.
I think that's what I just said.
Please do not leave the unreached unattended. Commit them to prayer, commit to learning, and then connect with those that have some experience. There's no need to begin. You mentioned the white horse, riding in as someone with all the solutions, but there are faithful believers, 30 years of faithfulness in this one group you've mentioned. There's a lot of wisdom to be brought together to the table here.
If I may just promote others, Max, because in every major unreached area of the world, there is a similar meetings that happen throughout the world. There is for North Africa, for the Middle East, for Indonesia, for China, for Southeast Asia. The large blocks of where these unreached peoples are, there are these type of collaborative meetings that are happening where people could really understand how they could see their churches engaged. So I'll just put that plug in for any of those regions.
If it's not Central Asia.
I'm a little selfish for Central Asia. But
Well, this has been very, very rich. Thank you. Now, you've mentioned a number of resources along the way that will all be captured in the show notes, but I wonder, just as we begin to wind down here, are there any others that you would recommend to our listeners? They might want to learn more about Central Asia.
Well, there's a couple websites. One is one of our great media partners in the region that's seeing great things happen. It's called globalheartministries.org. You can see a lot of what's being produced in media. One is actually the North American Central Asia Forum website that has just tons of tools. And if you go under the Central Asia tab, you can see all kinds of videos about the region and various other things. And that's simply nacaf1.net/Central Asia. And there's a secular book that really helps people understand the region. It's called 3 Cups of Tea by Greg Mortensen. If you don't understand tea drinking, you won't understand Central Asia. Okay, I'll just say that.
Okay, good.
And then there was one written by actually this gentleman pastors a church now in Columbus, Ohio, or near it. It's called 5 Minutes to Midnight. He was a worker in the region for many years. Andy Sieberhagen. Yeah, those are just a few great resources that people could look to. And as I mentioned, I think I mentioned Prayercast as well, has some great things about the region of Central Asia.
Well, this has been very helpful. And earlier in the program, we mentioned your email address. I'll just quickly say it again here. It's Bruce at CalvaryGR, as in Grand Rapids, calvarygr.org. And Pastor Bruce would welcome your inquiry there. Bruce, I just want to say thank you so much for spending this time with us today. I have learned a lot. It's been encouragement to my heart, too, and I really believe it will be to our group as well. Thank you for your faithful service over many years to learn and to help and to share it with us today.
Thank you, Mags. Great being with you, and I always like to see you face to face, but it's great talking with you over the podcast today. So blessings on you, brother.
Well, that concludes our conversation with Pastor Bruce. Thank you for joining us. If you enjoyed this update about Central Asia, we invite you to keep listening for highlights from other regions of the world that we will share in future episodes. There were lots of resources mentioned during this episode, and you can find the show notes at globalmissionspodcast.com. There will be links to all of those resources that Pastor Bruce mentioned, as well as a link to his contact in Grand Rapids. If you enjoyed this episode, we invite you to subscribe. And if you would leave us a review on iTunes or in whichever app you use to listen to the podcast, we would be grateful. That's all for now. This episode is brought to you by the Global Missions Toolbox and produced by Send International and the Jaffrey Center for Global Initiatives in collaboration with other like-minded agencies. On behalf of our entire team, thanks for listening. Join us again in 2 weeks when we'll continue to explore this grand adventure of being Christ's witnesses to the ends of the earth.